Okay, welcome everybody. We're really happy to have you join us today from Instincts at Work. We're putting together a series of webinars, and our objective really is to help support the people we work with. Our vision at Instincts at Work is to lead leaders in health system transformation. And in interacting with our clients of late, we've been hearing a lot about the need for resilience through challenging times. And so we've put together a presentation today that we want to invite you to work with, to explore around building resilience through self-compassion. I'm Penny Pauscha. I'm the founder and principal of Instincts at Work. We have with us today Renee Freeman. Renee Freeman is one of our coaches, and she's also a registered nurse that's worked in acute care settings. And so Renee is going to be taking us through the content today and leading us through and facilitating today's session. And we're delighted to have with us two very special guests for today's presentation, our webinar today, and both of whom are also graduates of our Evolution of Thinking program. And so they're part of those leaders who are leading system transformation through evolving how they think. And so it's really exciting to have them with us today. We have Dr. Becky Van Ursel, who's a family physician, and she's going to present some work that's informed by the work of Brene Brown, where she's been doing some training with her as a certified Daring Way facilitator. So she's a candidate for that. And she's going to be talking about the impact of perfectionism and overfunctioning in healthcare, and in healthcare and healthcare leadership, which is a very relevant theme for a lot of the leaders that we work with. And she's going to be talking about how connection, courage, and compassion can help us to build resilience. So it's great that you're here, Becky. And we also have with us Dr. Anne Duval, who's also a family physician. And Anne is going to introduce us to some tools to help us practice some self-compassion, which is based on the work of Dr. Kristin Neff and Dr. Chris Germer. And she's been doing some training in that and has some wonderful exercises for us to share and to practice, to try to help all of you as you're doing your work throughout the healthcare system to improve care for the people we serve, to also fill up your tank to build your own resilience and so that we can come together and really create some transformation. So thank you for joining us, and I'm going to hand it over now to Renee.
Great, thank you, Penny. Okay, so before we start, we'd just like to offer you the opportunity throughout the webinar that we're going to share with you today to take some time to reflect on the questions that we ask you, and we will be prompting you for that. And so if you want to and just to also look at things that comes up for you, but also some concepts that maybe you haven't heard before. And so we want you to have that opportunity to take that time to think about it and pause and reflect. So if you want to pause the recording now, you can, just to get your journal, if you have a pen and paper to write something down, or if you have an electronic device that you'd like to keep notes on. We ask if you want to do that now, you can do that, pause, and then come back and press play when you're ready to start. Okay, let's start. So our intention and outcome is a tool that we use with our clients. Many of you have heard about this, and for those of you who are brand new to this, it's a tool that we use. It's similar to an agenda, but it's something that's it's based on the intention is around how do we want our participants or our folks that are in meetings, how we want them to feel, and we craft for that. And then the outcomes are again more of a concrete result. What is we want to see by the end of the meeting and at the call and in this particular example, the end of this webinar. So our outcomes today, we'd like to give you a sense of how connection, again, as Penny was talking about, and courage and compassion can build resiliency. We're going to go through that. And then we're going to also, one of the outcomes will be really around normalizing the stress response. And specifically around, we're going to be looking at, as Penny talked about, perfectionism and how perfectionism itself, it looks like it's a space to protect ourselves in some ways, but it really can cause a lot more stress, especially when we are in times when there's a lot of uncertainty. And so we're going to look at choosing your way into those more adaptive strategies, and then actually do some practice around strategies to build resilience. So those are the 3 outcomes that we have organized and designed for you today. So to start off our conversation this afternoon or today or whenever you're looking at it, we're going to be, I want to talk to you about the CNAFM framework. So this is, we use this, and again, for those of you who've heard us talk about this before, we love talking about this framework and using this as a context that gives us a way to match leadership to different contexts. And so we need different leadership skills within different contexts. And as you can see, and within the different frames, as you increase your variables, there's an increased number of interactions and in between those variables. And so and then as you get to chaotic, which I'll talk about a little bit more in a second, that predictability in the variables, there is no predictability in variables in that context. And so to walk it through, and then how does that relate to perfectionism and courage, compassion, and connection? I'll get there in a second, but this is again something that you can use as a tool to get a sense about where you're at and where you're thinking and what situation you need to think about, how you're thinking about it. So I'm going to use an example of something, background in infection control. I'm going to use something that I know very well about is hand hygiene as an example, and to go through this framework. So when we think about hand hygiene as in a simple context, hand hygiene is something that we've all grown up as children. We know it's as simple as we clean our hands when they're dirty. And there's different reasons why, literally, if you've got soil on your hands or you've been playing outside. And so and there's different reasons, or when you actually clean your hands is before you eat, after you use the facilities and that kind of thing. So that's a simple example of that we all know about. And then in healthcare, what we know as trained as in healthcare providers, that we know that hand hygiene is and it's evidence-based. It's the single most important way of preventing transmission of organisms that could potentially cause infections if the hands aren't cleaned. And so that's something that we know, and it's a best practice. We use a product, clean our hands, carry on and go on to the next thing. So that's something, again, we sense, we know what's happening. It's categorized in sense of this is the practice we do, and then we act on it. But then we move into complicated. So complicated would be when back in the day when there was only really soap and water was our choice. Now we moved into using alcohol-based hand rub when that was introduced. So now we've got a variable that is, it became back to best practice was eventually to use alcohol-based hand rubs or hand sanitizers instead of soap and water, or in place of soap and water. So over the years, as you can see, all those little nubs there, that became became more complicated. So when do I use my hand? When do I clean my hands with soap and water versus alcohol-based hand rub? Well, it's based on maybe if certain organisms you can't use with soap and water or alcohol-based hand rub. It could be based on, well, we don't have sinks in this room, so we'll use alcohol-based hand rub at point of care. So it becomes more complicated, but at the end of the day, there's still good evidence. There's still good practice in terms of we want you to clean your hands, and there's different options to use it, right? So that's something that isn't debatable. And so again, we sense it, we analyze, we have the data, we've got our experts that help us, guide us to let us know what we need to do to how to ultimately prevent risk of transmission. We're using a healthcare example specifically of bugs being transmitted through the environment. So on the right-hand side, we have answers. So when we move into the left-hand side and we move into complexity, we'll still use the same example, is now we move into, we've got different kinds of products to use to clean your hands. We've got different kinds of hand sanitizers. We've got different kinds of soaps. We've got antimicrobials, when to use that. Then we have a whole set of what happens in the surgical suite. So we have another whole types of products to use. So it goes on and on. The other thing that's complicated that became, I would say in the last 10 years, was around monitoring hand hygiene and the complication and the complexity about hand. How do we monitor, keep track of making sure that we're actually cleaning hands when we're supposed to? And so then it became the complexity of how do we monitor, well, every situation is different. Is it subjective? Do we have a person that does it? Do we have a machine that does it? Do we have a product that dispenses a certain amount of product that will tell us how many opportunities there were to clean your hands? I mean, as you can appreciate, it goes on and on. So it became really complex. And then you throw in the last little piece more recently when hand hygiene rates were published publicly. And so it became a funding model issue based on if your rates were at a certain number, then organizations didn't get a certain amount of funding. So then it becomes even more complex. And then almost you eventually sort of lose the thread of back to simple. We just need to clean our hands when we need to clean our hands. And so it becomes complex. So it's back to probing in terms of looking, okay, so where in this scenario, in this ambulatory setting, we need to do it like this, but in this critical care unit, we need to do it like this. And then we respond. But we have to, it's based on what's emerging at the time and what our capacities are. And then we move into where we are present day into chaos. And I'll throw in the hand hygiene example again, is now we're at the point where we actually, in a lot of places, don't even have the product that we can use to actually clean our hands. So now we're actually moving into chaos where we have places that are producing alcohol-based hand rubs, like distilleries, and they're actually using that product so we can replace it, because a lot of places are no longer have product to use. And so the chaos part of that is now people are using there's already been reports where people are using that product, and it's causing so much skin breakdown because they don't have the emollients based in that product that healthcare providers no longer can provide the care that they need to provide, and they're off work. And so they're not off work because they're sick or they're stressed, because they actually have damaged skin. And so we have beyond chaos. So it's just an example of, we had to act. It wasn't a wrongness. Leaders had to make decisions. We're running out of alcohol. So what do we need to do? We need to have other products, other places that previously wouldn't have made alcohol-based hand rubs to make the product. So we have it. They acted, we sensed it, responding, and now we're seeing some challenges with it. So, but again, the point that we want to make in all of this is that, when based on the context, the leader has to think about things in a different way. And so the reason we're bringing it up today is that we want to make sure that, when we talk about perfection and then perfectionism, back to that need for getting it right, there's no longer an option, which is creating so much stress. So on the left-hand side, we have the answers, and that works well for those of us who have that real tendency of getting it right. We have the answers. The left-hand side, we don't, and specifically in chaos, there isn't the evidence anymore. We can't sort of focus on what's the right thing to do. We have to respond. And so that actually itself can really affect those of us who are really, really working hard to get it right. And that's back to the burnout and back to we're seeing more reactive responses than usual. So if you want to just think about that for a second and think about how maybe that's showing up for you. Not official prompt, but there was a lot going on there. So, so as we move into that, we wanted just to bring up the slide from safety to purpose. And again, it's back to thinking about reactive mindsets and creative mindsets. And again, just to remember, there's not one isn't more right than the other. It's just, especially during times when there's a lot of uncertainty, those of us who are, who tend to be, and we'll talk about in a second, back to the creative mindset, which is achieving through purpose, which is relating, revealing, understanding, achieving. These are all adaptive strategies that we do when we're thinking about what do we need to do in terms of how do we move this project, move these ideas forward. And so these are all strategies that we put in place. And relating is connecting with others. Revealing is talking about, I feel uncomfortable, let's talk about this. Understanding, getting a real sense of, and we'll talk a little bit around empathy, having an understanding about this is what the situation is. Let's move forward based on consensus, based on what we know we can do. And then achieving is, this is the outcomes, this is where we need to go. So for those of us who are sort of tend to be more in that creative mindset, that prefrontal cortex, or that thinking, the green part you see, where we're clear making those decisions, when we have that chaotic environment, back to creative, into the very active mindset, we think about that is around keeping keeping yourself safe. And that's a strategies that we use in that is around complying, controlling, and protecting. And so when we think about the red part is for those of you who haven't seen this before, that's our amygdala, our hijack, or our limbic system, our emotional response. And so we're seeing a lot more reactive responses and again, even outside of pandemic or crisis happening, we can ping pong between these mindsets at any given time. And so these are the behaviors back to like complying, following the rules, protecting, shut down, controlling, micromanaging, or making sure that you've got everything, all your pieces lined up so that you can prevent any chaos from happening. And so again, to sort of link it back to the last slide is to, think about as a leader, where are you at and where are you functioning? Am I a reactive mindset today or am I a creative mindset? And this again can ping pong depending on throughout the whole day. And a lot of leaders reported when we've done this, when we've talked about this the last little while, some of the leaders who've done this work are really sitting in that creative mindset and they're thinking about things, but they're having to really help manage other folks that are in that reactive mindset, which can cause them to go into reactive mindset. So it's just, again, really a reflective piece right now. I invite you to think about how often am I sitting in reactive mindset? Where am I sitting in that space where I need to keep myself safe in my thinking? And how much am I spending my time in creative mindset? So as we move into, we just wanted to flag some specifically and concrete examples of creative and reactive mindsets or responses. So underreacting would look like, again, I sort of talked about staying quiet, being sort of cutting off, shutting off, not saying very much in meetings, maybe more so than you normally wouldn't, minimizing empathy, so as not to get so much in the drama. So again, that may look like you're shut off or more quiet, when you may be more in other situations, you may be more outgoing, you might be more involved. We might underplaying the situation. Oh, it's fine. It's going to be okay. We're going to be okay. But inside, you probably feel that's not okay. But you'll see other folks, acting that way. That this is okay. There's a lot of conspiracy theories going on, and so that can show up that way. Avoiding situations and also numbing. So numbing can look like we talked about last time with folks was around. Numbing can look like overeating. A lot of people are baking, eating a lot of things that you normally wouldn't eat in the past, or drinking is a thing that people joke about too, how much they're more than people who normally don't drink. And these are just examples. Numbing can also be just over checking out, watching a lot more TV than you normally do. So these are not bad strategies. They're just things that show up, and just as a flag about where am I sitting in this. Other responses could be overreacting. So again, over controlling, over obsessing, constantly looking at what's happening in the media. What are the numbers? What's happening in terms of outside of pandemic? It could even just look like, reading all of trying to keep up to date with all your journal readings and what's the most evidence, and before we can move a project, we have to do that consensus seeking and try to get as much information from all the different parties before we can move forward. And then that oversharing of uncertain information can also look like a reactive response, and explaining, oh, did you hear? And oh, did you hear? And oh, did you hear? So that's also something that you might see. So what we're inviting you to think about and look at are some adaptive strategies. And that looks more like into that creative mindset that I was talking about. So it's, again, reading the situation. What's required of me right now? What do I need to do? Where am I at? Are we thinking like complicated or simple responses when we're actually in a chaotic or a complex, we need complex ways of thinking where we need to probe more? Where am I at right now? Or where is the team at right now? Staying attuned to what people need. Again, do we need to be more quiet? Do we need to be more innovative? Are people getting stuck in sort of going down the rabbit hole of details? Do we need to pull ourselves out and think about how do we move the needle on this? Maybe things like empathizing and labeling, and we'll talk about those strategies around just naming what's in the space, what's going on for them emotionally. and in the meeting, and then moving on. Staying true to a course of action. Okay, guys, we said that we were going to go here. Yes, we've had some stumbling blocks in between. We've had some extra directives from the ministry. Okay, but we're going to move forward anyways. We're going to move forward what we can do, and focusing on the areas of what you can take action on. And so again, it's just to think about how, when we think about these different responses, and when we're going to be talking around perfectionism and boundaries, how these different responses can really show up, and around, again, protecting self from really trying to not be back to being not good enough and not being seen. I've had clients most recently talking around back to imposter syndromes. Like, I really shouldn't be here. I don't know if I can do this anymore. I'm pretending I think it's going to be okay, but I don't know if I can really lead this initiative anymore. And so I think it's back to really managing that, all of those doubts, all of that self-judgment, and moving into some of those adaptive strategies, which we'll go into, is around back to self-compassion, and looking at how do we use courage, how do we use connection, and how do we use oh my goodness, I've just drawn by connection into creating, into moving into that, and moving self out of that judgment, both of self and others. Okay, so I'm going to then pass it over to you, Becky, and lead us into talking about those. We've been talking about some of those stress responses, and then specifically in some of the work that you've been aware of and been doing. I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you. So I'm going to chat through perfectionism for a little bit, and start with some definitions and differentiating between perfectionism and healthy striving. So perfectionism is different than healthy striving, right? And I think many of us hide our perfectionism behind healthy striving. So, who wouldn't want their physician, for example, to be a perfectionist? I know I would. And I think what most people are saying is, I want them to actually be a healthy striver. I want them to know that they're doing their best. They're looking for things there. So what perfectionism is, though, really is what will they think? And healthy striving is, how can I improve in general? And those are clearly not Webster's definitions, but I think they're a really good barometer for what we're talking about, and an easy way to remember it. So to put a finer edge on it, perfectionism is the belief that if we live perfect, if we look perfect, if we act perfect, then we can minimize the pain of inadequacy or failure. And it's a shield against those not enough gremlins that can come out and haunt you in the back of your mind. It's about trying to earn approval and acceptance. It's that please, perform, perfect cycle that is often born out of years of formative years of praise for accomplishments, rather than simply who you are and for being. And it's the belief that I am what I accomplish, and how well I accomplish it. And it is other focused. It's what will they think. Perfectionism is not striving to be your best. It's not about healthy achievement or growth. And healthy striving is, in contrast to that, very self-focused. It's a how can I improve? So when you imagine perfectionism, it's pretty easy to see how that can feed into the overreacting or overfunctioning, and the underreacting and underfunctioning that Renee was just talking about. So moving on to the next slide, I want to talk about this perfectionism cyclone. So the real danger with perfectionism is that it is self-fulfilling. So I call this kind of the perfectionism cyclone, or the perfect storm towards burnout. And I believe that it is actually a significant root cause for burnout within healthcare. So if you act and succeed, then it reinforces the perfectionism, and you should just do more of that again. If you act and you fail, it was because you weren't perfect enough, and you should do more of that and better, and try and be more perfect again next time. So regardless, it reinforces this cycle. The catch-22, of course, is that there is no such thing as perfect. And so it's setting up failure, and it's a self-destructive cycle. So why it's so common, latent, and dangerous, and going back to that can happen from the beginning, is when there are answers, it's actually relatively easy to hide perfectionism for healthy striving, because you can find the answers that you're seeking. And the problem is that when you tip over and things are no longer as linear, and you tip over into that complex and chaotic world, there are no answers, and that becomes more obvious, but it doesn't change this cyclone. And so you just start spinning out of control. And so what you'll often see is not just the perfectionism fall apart, but the person behind that perfectionism really start to unravel and become much more reactive, and you'll see those behaviors. And their shield is down. They're no longer the expert. People will know that imposter syndrome, their vulnerability is exposed. And when people are feeling vulnerable, when their inadequacy and their failure risks being exposed because their perfectionism shield is down, you'll start to see some really interesting reactions. And certainly I know in my world right now, and in the hospital, I'm seeing a lot of that from colleagues. So especially in healthcare and healthcare leadership, as a physician, our perfectionism's been cultivated and reinforced for many years. And as healthcare was in that more linear, complicated realm for many years, I think that served the healthcare system. It served us well, and certainly was reinforced systematically. But as healthcare system is increasingly complex, and certainly in this pandemic, arguably even chaotic, that linearity is gone, and our training is no longer preparing us for this moment. So what I'd like to do, if we move on to the next slide, I'd love for you to take a moment and press pause if you want, if this question resonates with you, and reflect for you in your life, how is perfectionism showing up for you right now, and jot that down. And then the next slide. So now that you've given some thought to how perfectionism is showing up for you, what we want to do is, as Renee was saying, lead you through some strategies to help build your resilience, to build that ability to go into a more adaptive and creative headspace in a more mindful way. And so, the three things that we want to cover for doing that would be around connection, courage, and compassion. So we'll give you some practices and some reflective strategies for that. So, Anne is going to take us through an exercise. And I think it's important when we talk about connection, just to recognize that that's to self, to others, to nature. So Anne, take it away.
So we're going to do an exercise now called Soles of the Feet. So Renee was talking about the amygdala hijack, when we really have a heightened threat response. And so what's important is to have strategies that can help ground you during that time. So this can be considered as an anchoring practice, as a way to calm your mind when you're feeling emotionally overwhelmed. So just take a moment. You're seated right now, and just close your eyes or lower your gaze, and notice the soles of your feet on the floor. If you have on shoes or slippers, you may want to take them off, and if you want to really feel the soles of your feet on the floor, you might even want to take your socks off. So first begin by noticing the sensations. The sense of touch. Is there tingling? Are they cool? Are they warm? Are they sweaty? Maybe you might have a bit of achiness in your feet, or on the other hand, you may not notice anything at all. but just be aware of the soles of your feet. Now, to get a better feel of the sensations in the soles of the feet, just lift up your right heel and come up onto your right toes and just go up and down, raise and lower your heel. And just feel what's going on with those little muscles in your feet or in your right foot. And after you've done that a few times, then change feet. So lift up your left heel, keeping your left toes on the floor, and just go back and forth. And just notice what parts of your foot touch the floor at any given time. Now just stop for a minute and now go on to the sides of your feet. Sort of pretend like you're skiing. So you go from edge to edge to edge and see what that feels like. Do your feet feel fluid? Do they feel stiff? And you may want to just lift your feet up off the floor and circle your ankles and see what happens to your feet when you're circling your ankles. Now just pause again and put both of your feet on the floor. And just consider how your feet support your whole body. Now your mind will have a tendency to wander, and that's perfectly normal. And when the mind has wandered, just feel the soles of your feet again. Now pretend like you're walking. So lift your right knee up and then raise your right foot, and left knee up and raise your left foot. And just keep going up and down, pretending that you're walking. And notice the sensation of lifting a foot and then placing it on the floor. And just pretend that you're walking ever so slowly. And as you're doing that, just appreciate how the small surface of your feet really is, and how your feet support your entire body. And if you wish, allow a moment of gratitude for the hard work that your feet are doing, which we usually take for granted. And just lower both of your feet onto the floor again. And if you like, leave an imprint of kindness or peace on the floor where both of your soles have landed. Now expand your awareness to your entire body and let yourself feel whatever you're feeling, and let yourself be just as you are. And as you're ready, open your eyes. So we're just going to reflect for a few moments. And just reflect on these few questions. What did you notice when you anchored your attention in your feet? And how did it impact your mental and emotional state? And you may want to pause here and ponder that a little bit before you move on to the next section.
So I'm going to start talking about courage with a quote. Courage does not always roar. Sometimes courage is the quiet voice at the end of the day saying, I'll try again tomorrow. So for me, one of the things that I'm noticing now during this pandemic and in our organizations is the need to set boundaries. And we're hearing echoes of that in different ways. The mantra that you'll hear coming out from provincial government that this is a marathon, not a sprint, for example, I think is one way of saying, how do you start to sustain yourself and what will this look like? And I wanted to talk about boundaries because I think it takes some courage within our healthcare structure and hierarchy and culture in order to create those boundaries. And as someone who is self-proclaimed not great at establishing boundaries myself, actually, it always felt really selfish. And there was a real moment that I had a shift where I heard Dr. Brene Brown talk about empathies without boundaries is not empathy. That's martyrdom, or maybe sympathy, or whatever word you want to fill in there. But that having boundaries allows us to live within the integrity of our empathy. So I would love for you to sit with that for a minute and then reflect on two questions. What boundaries could you put in place to help you remain creative and adaptive and to sustain your marathon, not your sprint? And how can you as a leader create the boundaries to support your team or support the boundaries that your team puts in place for themselves? And what would that look like?
We'll move on to compassion. And compassion is generally directed towards others. And as a loose definition, compassion is a feeling that arises when you are confronted by another's suffering and you feel motivated to relieve that suffering. But what if we start to direct that compassion towards ourselves? A novel thought for lots of people. And we call that self-compassion. Just a shortcut way to think about it is just give yourself a bit of slack. So Kristin Neff has shown three components for self-compassion. And the first is mindfulness. The second is common humanity. And the third is self-kindness. So Renee will introduce the hand and amygdala wash as a mindfulness practice. And then following that, I will come back with another practice that incorporates all three components.
Thank you. So this is a tool that we talk about when we talk about amygdala washing specifically. It's around a tool we use with our programs around clearing the space. And this is something that when you think the left hand of the screen, which is all foggy, so this is something where you might not be feeling clear about what's happening. You might have had a very difficult conversation. You just came from a call with a client or a patient or a colleague, or it could be something at home. And so the idea is that we want to talk about labeling the emotion. And we know research tells us that just simple categorizing the emotion or labeling it enough will manage that. We'll sort of, when we talk about the beginning of the talk this today, was the red and the green, and that, so when you're in that threat response or in that foggy zone, you're really not sure what's going on. That red is a little bit, it's a theoretical concept, but it's sort of bigger. So it's more intense, it's bigger, and the prefrontal cortex is smaller. So the idea is to do our best thinking and move into the blue sky thinking. So we really want to manage that threat response and dampen down that limbic system, so we can do our best thinking. And so when we talked about the amygdala and hand washing, we used it we talked about as a bundle practice of, again, so when we're doing that clearing the space and noticing what's in the background, it could be just really simple as, wow, I'm feeling really uncomfortable right now after this meeting. And you can just label it as, I'm feeling sad, I'm feeling frustrated, label it. And then we can bundle practice it with something else that you're doing. So this might be the only time in the day, and if you're working from home, when you're using the facilities, washing your hands, and you can take that time back to the self-compassion break is to, okay, so I'm going to clear this now, literally as I'm washing. Sometimes you can do it in the shower when you're having your morning, you wake up and you have that, sometimes have the dread or have the anxiety about you're starting your day. So you can also use that as a wash, as a cleansing sort of exercise while you're in the shower. And doing that same thing where, okay, what's in the space for me, and then putting it aside. So we call it the amygdala hand and amygdala washing. And I just wanted to put this up so that for those of you who hadn't heard this before, that it is backed as a 3-step process for the amygdala washing. Is, again, ask yourself what is running in the background for me and what's pulling my attention. Label the emotion in a word if you can. So anxiety, frustration, overwhelm, excitement. Because again, the brain doesn't know the difference being upset versus being excited. So you could actually be really excited about something and you can't focus, like preparing for, a party or something. And then the last step would be to say to yourself, I'm going to move that emotion to the side so I can focus powerfully on this webinar, this child, your patient, this meeting, my colleagues that's in front of me that I have to deliver some difficult information to. So it's just a manage. So you can do this anytime throughout the day. So again, it's just a concrete practice or strategy that you can do when you're doing other things. Like I said, cleaning hands, walking. I use this when I walk in between meetings. If you're in an actual building going from meeting to meeting, sometimes just that walking, you can do that at the same time. So that's a practice that we suggest that you try. Okay, so then we're going to move on to our last adaptive strategy that Anne is going to take us through, which will continue to help support our self-compassion journey. Anne.
I love this picture where it's got the connection between the brain and the heart. And yes, often we live so much from the neck up, forget about what goes on from the neck down. So what we're going to do right now is we're going to expand on the amygdala wash. The amygdala wash, during that time, you acknowledged an emotion, and then you pushed it aside so that you could carry on. So you named it, but you wanted to clear it so that you can move on. But this practice actually includes self-compassion. So we add to the amygdala wash. So this is an informal practice called supportive or soothing touch. And the reason that we do that is that touch is a real key signal of compassion for all mammals. So if you give somebody a hug, you get an oxytocin surge. That's that mammalian caregiving hormone. And it reduces the stress response. But you can do it to yourself as well in a way that you may touch different parts of your body that actually give you that same oxytocin hit. So what I'd like you to do again is just close your eyes or lower your gaze. And we're going to just take some time to explore what different supportive touch or soothing touch, however you would like to call it, can be experienced. So just try some of these options and see what works for you. Put one hand over your heart. You can try putting 2 hands over your heart. Or if you really need to give yourself a big boost, you can cup one hand over a fist over the heart. You can maybe try one hand on the belly and the other one on the heart. Or put a hand on your cheek. Or cradle your face in your hands. You can either cross your arms and give yourself a gentle little squeeze and see what that feels like. Or you can cup your hands in your lap. And if that doesn't really resonate with you, you could just use a soothing voice instead. Just something that will calm you, because even that soothing voice will increase your oxytocin and reduce your stress response. So just spend just a few moments and just explore the soothing touch on your own, just for a little bit, and just see where it feels right for you to do that. So another option for that would just be to touch something soft. And when you're at home, you may want to just pet your cat or your dog, and it does the same thing. So when might you use this? I know that I have used it before a tense meeting. And so I'm not there putting my hand on my heart for everybody to see, but I've got my hands under the table and I'm actually holding my hand to make myself feel better. So you can use this in a very discreet way so that nobody knows you're doing it, but when you know that you need that extra little bit of support. The other thing is if you really need one of these and you aren't in a place where you want people to see that, you can either go into a toilet stall where you know that you're going to be there on your own, nobody's going to bug you, and just give yourself what you need. So just different ways that you can use that soothing touch. So we're going to progress into another informal practice called the self-compassion break. And this can be a quick and efficient self-compassion practice that can be applied whenever you find yourself in a difficult situation. Now today, because this is new, we're just going to slow it down. And it's going to be just like a reflective meditation, just so that you can learn the concepts. But after you've done it a few times, you can pull it out of your toolkit at the right time. So again, I would invite you to close your eyes, partially or fully, and bring to mind a situation in your life that's difficult, something that's causing you stress. So it could be a work problem, a health problem, a relationship problem, or even a friend who may be struggling with something. So just choose a problem in the mild to moderate range and not a really big problem. We don't want you to overwhelm yourself as you first learn this skill of self-compassion. Allow yourself to see, hear, and feel your way into the problem to the extent that you experience some uneasiness in your body. Where do you feel it the most? It may be in your throat, it may be in your belly, it may be in your shoulders. And then just say to yourself, slowly and kindly, this is a moment of suffering or difficulty or a moment of hardship or stress. That is mindfulness. Other options could be, this is really stressful, or this is really hurtful. And then you can say to yourself, suffering is part of living, which is common humanity. Probably billions of people have felt the same way that you do. Other options you could say is, I'm not alone. Others are just like me. Or we all struggle in our lives. But know that you're not alone. And during this time, you can put your hands wherever it feels soothing and feeling the warmth and gentle touch of your hands. So it could be over your heart, on your lap, on your forearms, whatever feels right for you. May I be kind to myself. That's self-kindness. Not judging yourself and treating yourself like you would a good friend. Other phrases you may want to use is, may I give myself what I need? May I accept myself as I am? Or even if that's too difficult, may I start to accept myself as I am? If you're having difficulty finding the right words, imagine that a dear friend or loved one is having the same problem as you. What would you say to this person, heart to heart? If your friend were to hold just a few of your words in their mind, what would you like them to be? What message would you like to deliver? Now, can you offer the same message to yourself? And just gently and slowly open your eyes. And take a few moments just to settle and reflect on this exercise. So when you said that first phrase, this is a moment of suffering or hardship or whatever, got the same message, did you notice any shifts? And what about the second phrase where suffering is a part of life and I'm not alone? Or the third one that said something like, may I be kind to myself? Were you able to speak heart to heart with a friend? And how was it to say the same words to yourself? Was that easier? Or was it more difficult? So research has shown that most people have a lot of difficulty giving compassion to themselves, more likely to others, but it's a great skill to develop. If you think about it, and you use the body as a metaphor. The heart has to pump blood to itself first before it can pump the blood around to the rest of the body. So it's really critical that you do look after yourself and provide yourself that self-compassion that you need. So again, this was an informal practice that took a little bit more time. It was a bit reflective just to get you thinking about it. But once you've done it a few times, you could pick out the phrases that make sense to you and use it whenever you feel the time is right. So is it back to?
Okay. Just wanted to close off our webinar today. We always, as part of our work together with our clients and with you today, we always want to invite people to take something that they've learned and move it into action. Again, the idea is that we set out on this journey to help you feel more calm, more focused, and also to help you build some adaptive strategies. And so we want to leave you with this question: what's one adaptive strategy to help you build resilience that you want to take forward? So out of the things that we talked about today, and I know I found myself thinking about a few points, thinking about the role of perfectionism and how we identify that, thinking about the connection, the courage, and the compassion. The ideas that stuck for me were around connection, letting yourself be just as you are. We had that beautiful connection exercise around grounding to ourselves, connecting with ourselves throughout the soles of our feet. So that might be an adaptive strategy that you particularly liked, or you found it grounding through your body. So we would encourage you to think about, how could you take that forward? How could you use that to build your resilience? Perhaps the idea of courage, that rang a bell for you. I love the idea about having boundaries allows us to experience and express our empathy. A lot of people are feeling empathy fatigue in the work that's really demanding. What kind of boundaries do you need to set? And how might you try to put some boundaries in place to preserve the importance of your empathy, not just for others, but also for yourself? And what kind of courage will that take from you to set that limit? So how might you play with that concept? The idea of compassion for ourselves. So Anne talked about giving ourselves a little bit of slack. How we give ourselves a little bit of slack, but also the idea about how we are mindful and with ourselves. And so we had some beautiful practices around how we interact with ourselves, how we touch ourselves in a soothing way. And also the very powerful exercise that I'm personally going to take forward around dissolving our resistance to suffering, being with when we're suffering, and just acknowledging it without having to do something. And how powerful that can be to just be present to ourselves in that way, as opposed to spending all day being present and giving to others and then coming home and checking out of our own experience because it feels overwhelming. Versus what if we tried something different? We tried to just be present with ourselves for that experience, and we brought that compassion to ourselves. So we're inviting you, we want to be the invitation for you to think about one of those adaptive strategies. Just choose one, and something that kind of struck a chord for you, and think about, how can I try that? And the more planful you are, like maybe when I go into work on such and such a day, I'm going to try it, or first thing in the morning, the more planful you can be about when you're going to try it, and the more concrete, the more likely you are to do that. And just, again, not as a pressured thing, notice what it creates for you that might build your resilience. So we wanted to thank you for taking the time out for yourself today. We want to acknowledge the importance of the work you're doing, how proud we are of all of the leadership work that you're doing, regardless of whether you think of yourself as a formal leader or not. Just being here is an act of leadership because you're leading yourself in terms of your own adaptive functioning and your own resilience. And we really would love to connect with you more about this. If you have other ideas or ways that you would like to see other webinars or other topics or an extension of this, we'd love to hear from you. So please come on over to our website at www.instinctsatwork.com. We'll have other resources for you, and we're certainly open to planning other webinars or other topics to try to support you and build your resilience as you move forward with this important work. So thank you very much for being here today and taking the time out. Thank you, Renee and Becky and Anne, for the wonderful job you did leading us through this. And we hope to have an in-person communication with you or a virtual communication with you sometime soon. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.